and I think it took His Holiness the Dalai Lama very much by surprise. Everyone was kind of focused on the march from Dharamsala, the nonviolent march to Delhi and then to the Tibetan border that the young Tibetan activists were doing. And His Holiness was quite worried about that also. He did not call for that either. That's something they did on their own initiative. And because there is an agreement between the Tibetan government in exile and the Indian government not to do political things on the sort of Indian territory where they are refugees. So the Chinese claim that this is the work of the Dalai Lama clique is very laughable, but also very sinister. And that is the main point I'd like to get across, is that when Wen Jiabao in his press conference, and also the hardline officials in Tibet, say this is the work of the Dalai Lama clique, this is very sinister, because the Dalai Lama clique is all of the Tibetan people. All of the Tibetan people follow the Dalai Lama and whatever he does and says, and the monks were just protesting about local conditions where some of them were arrested at the last Congressional Gold Medal Award last fall, and they went and painted the monastery in celebration because they were forbidden to have a formal celebration, but they were arrested anyway, monks of Drebung Monastery. And so they were marching peacefully and nonviolently on the March 10th occasion in order to protest those conditions, as well as to celebrate the day, knowing full well that they might bring onto themselves the full force of the Chinese intolerance of any sort of demonstration by Tibetans in Tibet. And then when they were shot at and when they were suppressed violently and beaten, then the Tibetan community exploded because they're a tinderbox, because China has been smothering them with immigration because of this train. 3 or 4 million people came pouring into Tibet. And also the Chinese have been pushing them very hard by making them denounce the Dalai Lama and controlling their studies and persecuting them in all kinds of ways. So it's a kind of spontaneous outburst of all the Tibetans all over Tibet, including all the areas where 2/3 of the Tibetan live outside of the Tibet Autonomous Region. So when they say the Chinese, the Dalai Lama clique, and that they have a life and death struggle with the Dalai Lama clique, what they're saying is they have a life and death struggle against all Tibetans, because there's no clique. It's just all of the Tibetans. So in a way, they're openly proclaiming their intention and their practice of trying to commit cultural genocide on the Tibetans, as the Dalai Lama says. And that the Dalai Lama called for either violence or nonviolence is ridiculous. He didn't call for either, because he knows that nonviolent protests in the face of the Chinese oppression leads to violence, because the Chinese will suppress it with violence, and then some Tibetans will not be able to keep the nonviolent discipline, as you saw on those videos from the Chinese state. They don't show you any videos, as independent journalists would have, of Chinese troops firing live ammunition into crowds and beating monks and so forth, which they always do.
Robert Thurman, your sense of, given the fact that we're about 200 days away from the Olympics in China, that the Tibetan people see this moment as a chance to be able to get before the world in a way that they've not been able to do in the past, what is going on in Tibet?
Well, yes, they do see it as that, but it's not really that calculated. In other words, they sort of see the Chinese sort of parading around saying we're so great and we're so nice to everybody and everyone in Tibet is so happy. And in other words, they see them saying that. And then they react emotionally to that because they are so miserable and they are being so oppressed and they are being completely violated, in their identity, and they're supposed to just stop being Tibetan, basically, which is what the Chinese are saying openly. And so it isn't like it's a calculated scheme. Now we're going to do something, to do something about the embarrass the Chinese. Not at all. Although, of course, the emotional feeling of most Tibetans is that the Chinese shouldn't be allowed to host the Olympics because the Chinese are not behaving in a civilized manner in Tibet. For sure, their genocidal face is absolutely clearly shown to the world in Tibet.
And Professor Thurman,
and the leadership is all for the Chinese to do the Olympics, because they feel that only if the Chinese sort of come out in the world and sort of try to be normal and be transparent and let people see what they're really doing, then they will stop doing all these totalitarian and dictatorial things.
Professor Thurman, we only have a few more seconds. You're very close to the Dalai Lama. You're coming out with a book on the Dalai Lama. What he said about stepping down as political leader of Tibet if the violence continues?
Yes, well, the context of that is like Gandhi. when sometimes they would have nonviolent nationwide strikes in India to protest the British domination of them, and then some members of the Gandhi's movement would sort of flip out, and there would be local violence somewhere. They would burn a police station or some things like that happen in the Indian independence movement. And in those times, immediately Gandhi would call off any sort of strike, and he would say he's not leading this, and he would denounce his own followers if they moved over from nonviolence to violence. And what the Dalai Lama is saying there merely is that if his followers lose the discipline of being nonviolent, which is what they mainly have done for 40 years or 50 years under the most extreme oppression, but if any of them blow it or lose it and it becomes like a violent movement, the young people who are impatient or the people in Tibet who are really being beaten too hard, then, however, he will not lead the movement because he will not adopt a violent strategy. That is what he's saying. And I'm sure that the Tibetans will react to that very strongly, although he's different than Gandhi in that he didn't call for this movement at the moment. But by saying that if they do violence, that's his reaction to those videos that the Chinese showed where some Tibetans were taking this chance to burn shops and things, which of course is very oppressive to them. They have no shops of their own in Lhasa. The Chinese have taken over all the commerce in Lhasa, and the Tibetans are really impoverished by the so-called development of Tibet, because the development of Tibet the Chinese have been doing is all to colonize it with Chinese. So it's developing it so Chinese can live there, which itself is futile because the Chinese can't live at 13,000 feet long term. They get sick.
Professor Robert Thurman,
really
we're going to have to leave it there, but I thank you very much for being with us, Professor of Indo-Tibetan Studies at Columbia University. Also on the line with us, we have been joined by Lhakpa Kyizom, who is a Tibetan activist speaking to us from Dharamsala, India. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org. When we come back, an Iraqi-American talks about his two countries on this 5th anniversary of war. Stay with us.